Well,
Oh, it's nice.
I'm gonna see if the stream is okay in HD
No, this is
before I walk away.
maybe we have to
Yeah.
blank it
Oh,
out.
that's nice.
Also.
Yeah.
The blanket.
No, this is.
I
It's
mean,
hard
is that
to
cold?
make sense of it like that.
Oh yeah. Oh, we'll do.
I don't want
At least
to
you can
say.
read your writing. I can't like.
No problem.
Afterwards.
Okay, we have many things to do today. I am thrilled that all of you are not here today,
I probably heard it.
but there must be a multitude of things going on.
Sure.
Can you not?
This frame rate is fishy.
We have 3 to 5.
I can't tell if it's because of my.
Oh, okay. So
But if
another
it's, I can finish at 4, but you just,
Yeah,
because I'm not on every
Yeah, I'll be there.
so I don't know.
Okay. Well, can you find out?
Mhm.
And let me know or take that Baroque thing at Temple.
Oh, good. I wish I could go.
You're sure it doesn't say Ramses?
Yes. I
Let's try
actually
another
want to
one.
go.
Let's
There's
try
Baroque
King Tut.
dancing.
Oh, it's super weird. It's super weird.
Oh, you should go. It's good.
Yeah. It's a Baroque dance demonstration at Temple that
Probably like
Leon
one
is
of the
like,
best ever.
yeah, apparently.
He's legit.
He was.
Okay, our frame rate is good.
excited about it yesterday.
I have a dinner at the rack.
Yeah, we're set.
Otherwise, I would just leave rehearsal early.
Okay.
Showtime.
Enjoy twice as
Did
much.
someone say Baroque?
Yeah, at Temple, of all places.
What is Baroque?
It's at 5 o'clock tonight.
It means
People
irregular.
think that my life is Baroque.
It's a really cool word. It means
It's
a
an
lot of
interesting
different
word.
things.
I don't know why we're stuck with those words. Classical, Baroque, romantic. What in the world does that mean?
What would you like to name?
What?
What would you like to name them?
Music. Music of the 16th century, music of the 17th century, music of the 18th century, music of the 19th century. And then it stops. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. It can never stop. Okay?
Like music of like various different composers.
Yeah, well,
Like, not
I
all
mean,
the composers.
my approach to music is, I beg your pardon? My approach to music history is, the exploration or the development, not the evolution, the development of musical technique.
Not the continuation.
Well, it's like
Prolongation.
language. Language doesn't evolve.
Yeah.
Music doesn't evolve. Music changes. It certainly does change, but it doesn't evolve. And the reason I say that is because I believe that, the capacity for language as well as the capacity for music and several other distinctive human cognitive abilities are innately structured in the brain, at least the basic platform. And so you have change over time, but you do not have evolution. The evolution of the cognitive platform for human beings happened not in the too distant past. And it's remained that way. There hasn't really been any substantial change in that faculty for 100,000 years or so. And evidence for that particular kind of mental activity, we've discussed this, doesn't really come into the archaeological record until about 40,000 years ago. So that's very, very recent. And there used to be this debate whether language was an early development or a later development. But that is a trick question. But the evidence points to the fact that language is a relatively recent development in the evolution of the human species. But the reason why it's a trick question is that the capacity for language was probably some kind of saltation or random mutation, which gave rise to a particular kind of mental activity that is unique to human beings. That then there were other elements that had been around for some of them millions of years that were exacted to facilitate the explication or the realization of language. And I say music. Both language and music apparently appear, or evidence of symbolic thinking appear in the evolutionary record about the same time. about 40,000 years ago. The earliest instruments, things that we can call instruments, 35,000 years ago. And the Egyptian system, which we were studying, I mean, the instruments we have go back, to actually pre-dynastic Egypt, or certainly from the Pharaohic dynasties, 3,500 BC. And so that's pretty recent in evolutionary time. So the idea that language arose very, very early and was a kind of adaptive thing, I don't think is the right story. I think probably that the unique mental capacity that human beings have built on pre-existing structures in the organism that were exapted. What does the word exapted mean? The word exaptation, I call it exaption, but it's exaptation as opposed to adaptation. When you say adaptation, you may also say adaption. So I shorten that to exaption, right? The exaptation is a made-up word, actually, by Stephen Jay Gould. At least he used it. So what is an exaption?
Well, it's probably.
I don't know.
Wait, what was the question?
Teleological.
I thought it was there's a Greek word.
Telos.
Yeah, right. But not the same.
Well, let's look it up. The other thing is that you must fire up your digital devices.
You
Right,
mean
because
teleological?
What?
Teleological?
No, teleological.
Or
Yes.
teleological?
Thank you.
Teleological.
Does it have to do with like its purpose as well?
Dr. Regan.
A reason or explanation for something in function of its end, the purpose or goal of something.
Yeah, with the purpose or a goal, right?
But also the
In other words, it's almost like predetermined to do something.
yeah,
Yep.
and also the reason or explanation for it is the other the logical part of it. Is that part of the word.
Well, Gould found that the term pre-adaptation was not quite right because because there are things that occur in evolutionary time that are definitely not, gradual. That there are these sudden shifts or discontinuities, and that what emerges out of those, the organism uses pre-existing mechanisms to adapt or to find a way to be used in a different way. And that is probably what language is. Language originates in some kind of mental or random change in the neurological structure, but then it had to find a way to become explicated or realized through the sensory motor system. And the mechanisms of the sensory motor system that the brain used to explicate language or turn it into speech had been there for a long while, had been developed for a long while. The auditory system and the emerging vocal tract, the larynx, we talked about this, the larynx and the pharynx presumably descended over the course of the evolution of Homo sapiens through Heidelbergensis, and then this event happened that created a new kind of mental structure, and it took quite a while for that to be matched up with the sensory motor system, and those things were in place for quite a while. All right, well, let's see. Today, I want to, there's so many things to do. I do want to do the two essays from air guitar, but I want to start with something from linguistics. And we're going to look at the sentence, which is not my sentence, it's one of those toy sentences, but it's practical, I think. John eats onions.
That's not very practical.
Well, don't you eat onions? Your name is not John. However, all right, let's look at that sentence. It's a curious sentence, right? Okay. Now, there are two ways, and maybe three, but two ways in which we could represent this, right? One is to use bracketing, and we'll say that eat onions, is a verb phrase, yes? Okay. We can also say that eat is a verb and onions is a noun, yes? But those two items together create a verb phrase, okay? And then we can say that John is a noun, right? And then all together, John eats onions is a sentence, all right? So this is composed or put together in phases or in elements. The thing is, this is two words which create a verb phrase, right? And what is the term for eat onions or a verb phrase? What would we call that? Not a word, but a... Haven't I said this before? It begins with the C. Constituent. This is a constituent. So this represents some kind of constituent structure. Now, you can obviously see the kind of relationship this might have, that I think that it has to music, right? Now, there's another way of representing this, and that is the famous tree structure. So we have a sentence, and then we have over here the noun, and then we have over here the verb phrase, which is constituted by the verb and the noun. Okay? Now, that's a pretty good explanation of what's happening in that sentence. Now, there are two things. You'll notice that the explanation noun, verb, noun doesn't really tell you that much, right? Because it would mean, apparently, that this is similar to that, right? We couldn't reverse this and say onions eat John unless it's a science fiction movie. Right? It'd be possible, I guess. Well, so the constituent structure clarifies the relationship of the nouns in the sentence, right? Okay, now, let's suppose I do this. Let's say that I try to do this to this, and we'll say that the sentence is equal to noun, John, verb, eats, and noun, onions. Whoops. Yeah. Okay. Now, that's radically different from this or this for the reason I explained over here. Yes? This says that there is no constituent structure. There's nothing that binds groups together that can clarify the function or internal function in the sentence, right? So technically, all this is just a string of words that have maybe parts of speech, function, whatever. But what happens if I say, and I've used this example many, many times, but I'll use it with this, John eats onions and Mary does too. And then suppose I say John eats onions and Mary does too, cheese. Does that make any sense? Mary does too, cheese. It sounds crazy, doesn't it?
Someone posing for a photo.
Only if you're holding a camera.
But what am I trying to say in that?
Mary eats cheese.
Well, that might be what you're saying.
cheese,
That's what you
onions.
infer from it. But
Like on a
what else?
Mary eats onion cheese.
Mary eats onions and maybe and cheese, whatever. But that's not how you interpret that, I think. However, look at the solutions you came up with. Your mind is so imaginative and so creative and so innately structured to understand what the basic thing is that you search for a solution, right? Now, I say this morning because it has something to do with things that we discussed last week. The difference between, and no, I'm not going to get into this again, competence and performance. Right? That it creates a kind of a complex boundary between those two issues. However, the intuitive sense is that you know that cheese is out of place. Yeah? But you can make sense out of it in a certain way. But the obvious thing is that John eats onions and Mary does too. What?
Cheese.
She eats.
No, Mary does too.
Eat onions.
Eat onions, yes. The constituent is eat onions. You know, I always use the example, John is a lawyer and so is Bill, a lawyer, right? So this kind of analysis or this kind of structural representation predicts that when we say Bill is a lawyer and so is John, a lawyer, that it adds that constituent. You don't have to pronounce it, but it's there, it's inferred. This kind of structure, which is nothing but basically counting or words added to other words, does not predict that. So essentially, technically, this theory is wrong, right? So this kind of representation or the structural analysis is correct. Language uses constituent structure. Well, I maintain that music certainly does use constituent structure. And in that sense, it must have some kind of relation, whatever it is, to properties of language, the way in which language is put together, or thought is put together and represented in the form of language. Are you with me so far? Okay. One final thing, and then we'll move on. I was up to 3 a.m. in the morning, pondering turn figures in Bach. Okay, how about this? Some people would call this a cantus firmus, right? I don't know. Oh. What do you think about that? Is that good or bad?
I recognize this.
Kind of, right?
Mostly.
Now, the counterpoint book, I'm not saying which one because, you know, we're on whatever, okay?
Can you really
The
call that a
counterpoint-
counterpoint book?
I beg your pardon?
Sorry.
Not my counterpoint.
Well,
I know
the
it's not
counterpoint
yours.
book.
I know whose book this is.
Okay, well, all right, well, you do, but I don't want to broadcast it to the world. Okay, so that book says, and most approaches to counterpoint would say that these only have like a contextual relationship to one another. And the fatal flaw is that, well, the fourth is this relationship. Well, it is not. It's not this. That doesn't imply that. If this cantus firmus, I think it's in Do, yeah, or C, whatever you want. That's not that relationship. Definitely not. All right? So that idea that the notes are contextually related by just interval, that's a turned upside down fifth, that's a third, that's a fifth, right? And that has the same value as that, right? And then, you know, it moves stepwise down minus the leap here, right? So that's the idea that you just join notes together contextually, right? I think that is a bogus theory, and I don't think that holds any kind of, validity. All right, well, there must be another way in which we can analyze this or look at it structurally so that the notes actually do make sense. Because I think if we were to play this series of notes and I would ask you to sing after the end of it, what would be the tonic? More likely than not, you would sing that. Yes? So there has to be something going on in the procession of these tones that add up to the expression of this. So somehow they've got to be related to one another, right? Well, you've heard me say this a million times, and you've seen me do this, right? That is some kind of dissonance in relationship to that note. So is this, yeah? Is that?
No.
No. Is this? No. Is this? No. Is this? Yes. Well, now look at this. At the end here, that is consonant with the do, right? And that is acting like a passing tone. All right. Well, that in itself forms a unit, yeah? This goes to here because it's coming from there, right? And we call that a passing tone. I maintain that that is the only type of relational element that exists in music. And it's what binds things together, and it's also what creates the idea of constituent in music. Okay, now, what about this? This seems problematic. If we take this and apply it to that, it's not entirely obvious where these two notes are coming from. Yes? It might be obvious for one of them, but then we have to apply an idea of structural distance rather than linear distance, right? And what is that? Which one of these notes is clearer to discern where it might be coming from?
Right, D.
Yes, the D, right? But notice that there's a note in between it. We might say that the C is going to a D, but then where is its completion?
E. Over there.
Maybe over here. Ultimately it is, I think. But it's actually not. There's got to be something in here that releases the tension from that note. That is the other side of, I think, a constituent here. And so there is something there. Otherwise, that would sound like an unfulfilled gap. It might sound that way. I don't think it does. What keeps it from sounding like a jarring gap in the structure?
The fa.
Well, that's one thing, because the relationship of fa and re create a what? Consonants. What about this?
Still consonant.
Likewise, yes? But whereas that note is a dissonance, that note is a consonance, right? So we have the famous 6-to-5 relationship to here, right? So let's go back. The continuity of the D has to be some kind of E, right? Okay, well, what about the F?
Comes from G.
Well, if we are applying the notion that's over here, we have to apply it here. This becomes a passing tone originating in G. Where should it go? Where should its goal be? E also. Well, now, this is the beauty of my incredible innovation, and it's equivalent to the, E equals MC squared, right? That is, I believe that the elements, the primitive elements of organization in a melodic line, and this is just an abstract formation, has to do with this kind of idea. And that this is the consonant frame that can manage the passing tone, which creates an argument structure between these two tones. If this goes to this, then this must go to that. So it's like an if-then proposition. It's purely abstract, right? So let's see if we might be able to reduce this to this kind of thing. Well, wait a minute. I've got to have other notes in here, right? If that is a dissonance, where might that come from? If that's going to be that kind of tone, it's got to come from something like that. Yes? Okay? And then there is another one. Where is that coming from?
Consonants.
It comes from this upper boundary, right? So, in essence, you've got this. Yes, that does constitute a triad. But you see that it's a product of some kind of merge of these 2/3. By the way, these are the only 3/3 that have a consonant status in the diatonic system. All right? So that means that if you have defined the C as a fundamental here, as pitch 1, or as the tonic, then the relationship between 1 and 3 will always be a what? Abstractly, has got to be a what? A consonance. Between 3 and 5, a consonance. Between 6 and 1, a consonance. Now we're getting somewhere. Those are abstract, fixed values, right? However, a tone by itself, just in outer space, does that have any relational properties? No, it's just a tone. As a matter of fact, a third, or a fifth, or a sixth, or a second, for that matter, has no value until it's put inside a system that can define relationships. Are we clear about this? Okay, well now, let's see, this is not exactly correct, but let's see what we can do. All right, the do has got to be part of that third. Where does the F come from? It's got to be part of that, so we have this, okay? All right, now, these are joined. You don't hear that note in the first third, and you don't hear the G, do you not? You also don't hear the E, right? Okay, now you may think this is strange, and it probably is. I don't know. Okay, well, where is that D coming from? Now, the other thing is, as you assemble this, you cannot look back. What happens if you look back?
You turn to salt.
Yes, you turn into a pillar of salt, right? No, you can't look back. The machine doesn't look, or computation does not look back, right? It continues onward, right, through phases. All right, so in order to get that D, we have to do what?
Again.
We have to do this again. We have to merge this again, right? All right, and this time, what is pronounced in this? You don't have that, and you don't have this. So we're bouncing this E along, as well as the C. This is pronounced, so far we've got this. Well, according to the theory of counterpoint, consonants together, dissonance in between, two dissonances cannot sound together unless they are
Transformed.
consonants. Now that is using a Schenkerian notation in a different way. That's like a linear unfolding, right? That's what that symbol is, the diagonal symbol connecting the two stems. And so, actually, that is a linear unfolding of that interval, right? I'm just using it in this specific way. Okay, all right, now, this leaves this hanging out in the air. Technically, where does this D go? It goes to the E. Technically, where does this F go? It would go to this E, right? The note is pronounced in the highest structural position, but neither one of these has any kind of pronouncing, right? It's hidden. This has no meaning unless somehow this is defined in the structure as coming from here and going to there, all right? Let's put these dots around this note, saying that that is what is supposed to resolve the passing tension of the F and also the ascending passing tension of the D, right? Okay, then we go on, and there is an external, well, it's not really external because these two tones are common. We have this merge. We have just that third. The tonic is not pronounced, but we do have this, which is creating, on a larger scale, the 5 to 6. That's inevitable, all right? And then, how do you get the G? With that, oh, we have the G and the E. Is that E this E? No. Because this E is not pronounced. It's pronounced in the highest position. So you see that this E, from the very beginning, is moved all the way to the end, right? And also, the C finally receives its confirmation at the end. Are you following this? So, this is a successive merge and move. And the things that you see moving in language, Chomsky says, are a result of the action of merge. And I believe that that is exactly what happens in music. Now look, the cantus firmus itself is an abstraction of melodic motion. And so this represents an even greater abstraction. And it tries to define how these tones are related to one another and why they are coherent. Now, this is a radical departure from the normal notions about how melodies are assembled, right? So the coherence in this is a result of the successive merge of these three little primitives, right? The three consonant primitives. They have an absolute value of consonants. They can contain their own relational tones. This one doesn't. They can be with or without. So we could have this is equivalent actually to A, B, C, or A, C, either way, right? So this is what connects that, this to that, and that to this. Are you clear? Are we clear? All right. Now, I wanted to... Now, remember that this is operating on just this level. Already, you see some kind of relationships that are on a higher level. And this is where we can apply the Schenkerian notion that we've got this plus the obvious 6 to 5, and then the arpeggiation of that triad down. But the triad itself is not something we begin with. So there is no such thing as the chord of nature as a triad, right? The triad is assembled by these consonant relationships. Yes, they form a kind of a triadic structure in the harmonic series, but you have to reduce the octaves of both of these tones, both the fifth and the third, to pull them into close proximity. You following this? All right, so yes, there is an acoustic basis for the concept of the triad, but there's not a structural basis or a musical basis for the triad as an entity. Now, the higher and higher we get in the structure and the assembly of more than one of these lines, things change dramatically. I don't know who the we is, but we've looked at combining several voices like this and trying to make these things line up. Well, sometimes they can, other times they can't. So what happens when you have 4 of these lining up? Most of this stuff is factored out, and you're looking at the relationship of consonants and dissonance on a vertical basis. And that is when you have principles of voice leading that emerge. They're always connected to this, but these things are factored out, and you have to look at them in the simultaneity in multiple voices. But they will line up. But you don't see this, obviously. Are you following that?
Sorry, 4 of what? Of primitives?
Yes, if you have 4 lines,
Okay.
melodic lines put together,
Oh, I see.
right? But then in music, you have other things that are going on. You have the idea of octave transfer. Any voice can appear in any octave register. You have other rules that apply. Then you also have the principle of gaps in the structure, where John eats onions and Mary does too. Eat onions.
Is that a gap, though, or is that just like a substitution of one way of expressing that constituent for another way?
Well, it's understood. In
Yeah.
other words, it structurally has to be there.
Yeah.
Mary, whose grandmother went to the grocery store to buy artichokes and ran into another friend that she hadn't seen in a long time, dropped dead. It's not her other friend that she hadn't seen in a long time that dropped dead. It's
Yeah.
Mary. And that's separated by extremely complex string of words. There are gaps in the internal clauses, right? As well as a gap between Mary and her untimely demise. Right? Okay. All right. Are you all with me? No. I hope so. If you're not really nervous, then this is not making an impression on you. Okay. I'm extremely nervous. All right. This is a really great... Oh, no, I'm not going to say that. Okay? This is a passage from a quite complicated technical book on Chomsky's revolutionary ideas, radical ideas.
Is the book called Ideas and Ideas? I'm just trying to read the cover.
Ideals and ideas.
Ideals, okay.
Okay? And it's extremely complicated. I mean, it's technical. If you wanted to read it, well, be my guest. I mean, I haven't gotten off the first page. All right. The strong minimalist thesis. And minimalism tries to do this. It tries to reduce the complexity in language to the barest minimum. Why is that? Why is that a scientific strategy?
Because in general, don't scientific principles and laws try to simplify rather than make more complex?
Also,
That's like a very general answer. But
Well, that's true.
Sorry, Alan.
Yes.
to understand, like, if there's a universal grammar between all languages, or like what to be able to understand on a very primal level what language is built off of, like taking away all the developments of specific languages or cultures.
Yeah, well, what you're doing is taking the cultural aspect out, which is actually a superficial idea. I mean, it definitely influences, but those are things that can vary in radical and different ways or arbitrary ways. And so that aspect refers to performance, or e-language is what Chomsky calls it. He wished he'd never called it that, because it, started a huge bonfire of the vanities. Okay? But the idea is to reduce it to something that is elemental or fundamental to the nature of a particular system. And no one knows, actually, how any of this is encoded into the brain. No one knows that. I mean, there have been some theories about it, but there's no way. If you can figure it out, well, more power to you, right? However, this is a proposal on the basis of what you see in a musical structure, right? In natural musical structures. And I maintain that this is common to essentially all musical structures, regardless of the tuning aberrations or any kind of inflectional properties in music. But these things must be present. Now, like languages, there's a whole portfolio of things that could exist in a language. Some languages use more than others. Some languages use only a few of them. But at their core, they're essentially the same. And that is a mark of, if you can get a theory that holds under these circumstances, then it probably has some kind of validity to it, right? The problem is that if the theory all of a sudden has to introduce a stipulation or some kind of exception to the rule, then just one exception can complicate the theory so that's probably not right. All right? As far as I can tell, this holds pretty much airtight all the way through most. I haven't looked at every single natural music in the world. I've looked at a lot of them, and I've also looked at so-called Western music from its beginnings all the way through, let's say, the beginning of the 20th century. And if you use this idea, you can see exactly where things went off the track or took a different direction. Let's be kind.
by natural music, do you mean all types of folk music?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So where did they go off the track, and why? Sherman.
Well, it means, well, first of all, we have to define what off the track means, right? It means something that is treated as a intellectual puzzle or something to solve, rather than something that is innately understood, like the onions and the cheese thing, right? We have an innate ability to figure that out, an intuitive ability. Now, in certain musical structures that arose in the 20th century, that was no longer true. That's a problem. And however, well, that's a whole philosophical issue in itself, and it's something that I'm attempting to address in the seminar and in my own work. You know, is that clear? Without saying any more?
To be continued.
Right. So, yes.
Well, Dr. Wallerstedt,
No, don't say it.
isn't this just solving the puzzle of music in a different way?
No,
Treating it
because
as a puzzle to be solved?
the thing is that scientific inquiry looks at things and you have to be puzzled about them. It doesn't mean that they are a puzzle.
So wouldn't it be fair to say that, the problem of the 12-tone method isn't that they were trying to treat it as a puzzle to be solved, but they were just on the wrong track completely in their scientific approach?
Well, I think that I think that approach is actually an intellectual approach, and that it is not connected to some kind of natural ability. However, the other thing is that, well, isn't the intellect, the ability to think and put words together and thought, isn't that part of language, or isn't that part of the fundamental mental capacity of human beings? Well, yes, but there's a difference between natural systems that express innate properties of mental structure and then the intellectual ability which can create puzzles to be solved. There's a difference between those two things. And it also borders on the difference between the purely intuitive and innate properties of language, the mechanical properties of language, and the psychological elements of language or thought. I don't want to go any further than that. Okay, the strong minimal thesis, that is reducing to the barest minimum, right, throws open the whole of linguistics to reconsideration, necessitating a reanalysis of all components. As always, it is necessary to separate the conceptual claims from the technical implementation of these claims in a formal system. Within the former of these, it is also important to keep apart that which is conceptually uncontroversial. Essentially, the appeal to Occam's razor. What in the world is that?
Simplest explanation is usually the correct.
Yes, the simplest explanation is the correct one. Even if the working out of that position gives rise to radical controversy, and the bold, apparently bizarre speculation that language is a perfect solution to the problem of linking representations of sound and meaning. Now, that is like a battle cry for me. And it is a perfect description of what I am trying to do in terms of music as a unique cognitive ability of human beings. It is not evolved directly from chimpanzee calls or from bird song or from anything else like that. It's the perfect solution to the problem of linking representations of sound and meaning. Well, what does meaning mean here in this case?
Wasn't it clear what meaning means in terms of language?
Well, what is meaning? I mean, the notion of meaning is all twisted around in psychological elements and the concept of semantics as what is read. Or what is blue? You know, it could be multiple meanings. Meanings is essentially syntax. In computer science, meaning or semantics is syntactical, yes? That is how we're using the word meaning. So it's a matching syntax with sound. And that's an Aristotelian idea. Language is sound with meaning, right? I would say that it's the opposite way around. Language is meaning interfaced with sound. And that is what music is. Music is syntactical relationships interfaced with sound. So at its core, music is essentially an abstract property, mental property of the brain. So it's a computational property. All animals have to have some ability to put information together neurologically, and the only solution to that is computational. Put two things together. But the mental computations in an ant are not the same as a human being, even though an ant can do things, calculations that no human being can possibly do. How it computes distances on the basis of the solar ephemeris, the position of the sun, is beyond recognition, and then counting the number of steps. That's a very complex computation. And if it is true that simply computation is the hallmark of intelligence, well, the ants are at the top of the scale, right? Which they apparently are not. They could be. Look at the roaches; they've been around longer than I have. Okay, are we with that? Okay. Now, the rest of the talk today can take one of three turns. It can be a train wreck. It can be a blank slate or a tabula rasa, or it can be a lightning bug. Those are the three choices for the rest of the class. If it's a train wreck, then if you haven't read air guitar or not with me on the same page, we could very easily run out of track, or there'd be some boulder in the middle of the track that's going to make the train run off the rails and crash and kill everybody, right? Then the other solution is that, well, nothing will happen. We'll just be blank. You'll sit there in a daze. However, it is my hope that the third possibility is the one that we'll get to, and that is the lightning bug. You obviously understand that that's a reference to one of the Neruda poems that we read about a month ago, and you should remember it immediately. Well, what is the lightning bug? It's my hope that you can have these random, expressions of light, right? That the light bulb will turn on, right? Just sporadically, and you'll have these random moments of insight, right? They keep blinking. All right, so let's all be lightning bugs. Okay. All right, now it's time for me to sit down. I want you all to, now this is going to be an amazing journey, I hope. And I would like for all of you to fire up those digital devices, and I would like for you to first look at or enter the terms deposition of the cross by Pontormo. And I'm fairly sure on Wikipedia that the painting will come up. Well, yeah? No?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Look at that painting. It's very muted. It looks like a Rembrandt, right? What kind of color do you see in that? It's vivid, yeah? It's looks like a cartoon, kind of, yeah?
Oh gosh.
I am putting words into your mouth, and I don't mean to do that. You're innately gifted with. You don't see it? What do you see in that painting? Does it tell you where that painting is?
Altars.
What town is it in? Florence. Well, everything is in Florence, right? Most everything. And it's in some kind of a chapel. I've forgotten the name of the people.
Santa
Sancta what?
Felicita.
Ah, Sancta Felicite.
And the Caponi Chapel.
And the Caponi Chapel. Yes, it's a private chapel. Okay. All right. Well, who is Sancta Felicite? How do you spell? How does it? How is it in Italian? Felicita? Is that what it says?
Yeah. So
Right.
like Felicity.
Look at the word. Yes, thanks for correcting me. I say everything with a Southern English accent, except when I'm dealing with singers. What does the word felicity mean?
Happiness, like luck.
It means extreme happiness. Yes. What's the other definition? Aren't there like 2 or 3? I think you should be looking up that
Isn't
word.
that the name of the character in Simple Hearts?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Well, yeah, it's like a name. Felicity
The-
Jones.
The ability to find appropriate expression for one's thoughts.
That's the second definition.
I'm
Or
looking for
a-
more about Google's rebelling.
A particularly effective feature of a work of literature or art.
Okay, well, I get all of that. All right, well, let's look at that painting for just a minute before we start discussing the 2 essays today. What are Pontormo's dates? Who was alive musically during Pontormo's lifetime? Yeah?
Yeah, see one?
When did Palestrina die?
1594.
That's right. Along with who else?
In the same year.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, one of those other guys.
Mm-hmm. One of the other major guys. Orlando de Lasso.
Oh.
Right. Their parking meters expired in the same year. Okay. And what Shakespeare play was written about that time? This is, somebody nailed me on this one. The dates have changed with the Shakespeare. But I was always taught that there were 3 things that happened around that time. The waning years of the 16th century. Romeo and Juliet. Pretty sure. I think that now, don't look it up because the date has been changed. What?
Well, they don't know for a lot of the plays.
Well, I
They have
know.
Various editions.
So I'm making it up. Okay, well, look at the painting again, right? What do you see in that? Is that medieval or Renaissance?
Like
If you were to
later.
look at it and not know when Pontormo's dates were, what would you say?
Renaissance.
Why?
Because there's movement and like brilliant color and like the face is actually like,
Medieval art doesn't have brilliant color in it?
well, it doesn't have those colors, and also like the people's faces are a lot more expressive than, and then like their bodies than most
And just the
medieval art.
advanced, the number of figures in the frame and the advanced level of realism and the draperies of the fabrics.
The softness of line.
It's their perspective.
Well,
There's
is it flat looking?
a little bit of dimension, not
Yeah, there's definitely
perspective, but definitely more than.
Are the robes static or are they moving around?
Moving around.
Yeah, there's a lot of motion in that.
Yeah, it's
And
almost
there is perspective in it, or there is a dimensional quality to it. Let's say that. Okay. All right. So, in order to give like dimension to faces and things like that, what is the art term for that?
Said this, I don't want.
What?
I'm remembering a word that's
Chiaroscuro.
Yeah.
Oh, that is
Is that the answer?
Chiaroscuro.
No, that's cool.
Oh,
That's it.
now I'm convinced. All right.
Right. The juxtaposition of light and dark to create, not perspective, but dimension. Yes.
Dr. Pupine.
Yes, very good. You get an A+. All right. Well, you can use that information. All right. But I think there's really a kind of an odd thing about it, this painting.
There's no cross in it.
Yeah.
No, that's one thing, right? That's kind of cut out. So that, I think, adds to like the humanistic element. There's another thing in it that is kind of strange.
There's
A
no
lot
like.
of things are strange.
There's no
Yeah,
like.
okay, well,
focal
what are they?
point. Really, it's just like a bunch of people. Mary looks pregnant.
Yeah, but she looks like she's like about ready to explode, right?
Yeah.
Emotionally explode,
Understandable,
right?
I guess.
What is Mary's? What is her size relationship to the other figures?
She's much
She's bigger.
smaller, but she's also.
She's much bigger.
Much bigger.
Wait. Well, are we clear on which one?
Which one? I guess we're
Yeah.
not clear which one is Mary. Oh, so she's
The blue one.
Yeah, yeah.
They're
Yeah.
all blue.
Yeah, that's the Virgin Mary's color,
mean-
right? Blue,
Oh.
Yeah.
right?
Is
Okay.
she bigger though? I don't know.
She's
Yeah,
the one who's
well, she
like
occupies more
fainting
space,
in the
I think.
background, right?
What?
She's the one who's like fainting, right?
No.
Who's falling and like reaching out her arm.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
All right, what about that figure that is to the right of Mary? Kind of in the corner.
The like beggar guy in the back.
Do we know
Is that John the Baptist?
No.
Because he always wears like the hair in Renaissance paintings.
He wasn't alive at that point.
That's right.
No,
He
he
got
was-
his head chopped off.
Yeah, well, that has some kind
Makes
of
sense.
bearing on the essays
Oh.
that we did today. Not a direct bearing.
Are these like random?
Oh, apparently that's
Bystanders?
him.
Oh,
Yes, it's Pontormo. Well, you're reading. Right?
No.
He
Well, I was
apparently put himself in that picture.
Wasn't that common?
Yeah.
Yes,
City
of
back
course
then?
it was common, right?
It's like
It's
Jesus
common.
has a head growing out
Might
of
as
his head.
well.
He's the only one wearing brown, like
Yeah.
not wearing bright colors.
Yeah.
So are all these
Oh.
people in this painting like particular people, or are they just like random bystanders?
Well, no one can
Oh, the other
identify who the rest of them were.
Okay.
But if you know anything about, the crucifixion, who was standing at the foot of the cross? Mary
Mary and Mary.
and Mary.
Whose grandmother went to the store to buy artichokes?
Yes, right.
Just
I've just gotten back from the store. No. Okay, well, I don't know if you can discern any of those figures in there. They might be in there. But there are no names for these people. It's just a commotion of people and the extremely turbulent emotion of the figure of Christ who's dead. And there's another thing that you find in Renaissance painting, and that is the depiction of lightness or of weightiness. The figure of Christ is twisting around a little bit, yes? Does it seem heavy or light?
Very heavy.
Very leaden, yes. And it's a kind of pathetic, angst or emotionally ridden picture. But what about the color?
He's
It's
Devoid.
extremely, it's almost like psychedelic, isn't it? Now, I know that that's a representation, but if you look, I think if you look at other reproductions of this, the color is fairly faithful. It is brilliant. The colors are very, very brilliant. This is not a fresco. This is an actual painting. It doesn't tell you oil on wood or something like that. All right. What?
Fancy word.
What did
No,
you say?
It's not tempera, it's oil on wood.
No, it's oil.
No,
That's
what
what it
it
says. Unless Wikipedia is wrong, which it could be.
Are we
No, I don't
suggesting that
think so.
Wikipedia's ever had an
It's infallible.
I don't believe anything that Wikipedia says. Okay, but at any rate. Okay, well now, let's go to Frida Kahlo. And here's where it gets very interesting, I think. Okay.
Michael's
What
yours.
page are we
I'll
on?
take mine.
all of
Akhenaten.
Where is
What page is this?
80s.
My mother said that she was going to name me Akhenaten, but she changed it to Ford.
They're-
All right, we were on
Same name.
page 76.
Okay.
Whoa, what?
Wow. I like want to stop on every single page.
Why did they?
This is an amazing painting. There are a lot of people in this painting, yes?
Yes.
Okay, this is called Moses, or the nucleus of creation. I don't think Kahlo referred to this as the nucleus of creation. She referred to it as Moses. Why on earth would she call it Moses? Well, there's little baby Moses down there, apparently in the
Third
Nile.
eye.
Right? Yeah, well, every time Kahlo depicted her beloved husband, Diego Rivera, right? He had the third eye. The third eye is what? The eye of, not the third heaven, but the third eye.
Wisdom.
Wisdom. You're reading. Yes. Well, good. That's the way That's the way we learn. You know. Okay. All right. Well, why is this? Look at all these figures in this. Can you interpret this?
No, we
Now, wait a minute. No. Look. Let's just say you're in an art museum. You have no idea who Frida Kahlo is. She could be just, you know, an actress, right? That you don't know about. But suppose you come upon this painting, right, and you look at it, and I think you would have to be jolted by it, right? It's like a mural almost. It's in, actually, I think it's in Houston, Texas. I'm not sure, but it could be. Does it tell you where it is?
Mexico City.
A private collection.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
like
think it's
where?
Houston, Texas. I could be wrong, but a lot of them are in Texas. Okay, unfortunately. Okay, well, wow, what do you think about this? What are the elements in this? Would you call this realistic
Very.
or realist?
No.
No.
A resounding
Would you
no.
call it symbolic?
Highly.
Yeah. Would you call it surreal?
I think so.
Yeah, it certainly is borders on that. What about perspective in this?
It's
None.
all messed up. Like it's not trying to be realistic with the size of things.
I think the two figures on either side. One of them looks like, Venus got tired of standing up on the half shelf and she sat down, right? Or in a recumbent position. But then you look on the other side over there and you see this, looks like a Native American or whatever, and the male figure is recumbent on the other side. What might that refer to? Is he also reclining on some kind of shell? Maybe. That looks like a clam shell to me, a giant clam. I don't know.
Well,
Might be
underneath it
something
looks like
soft.
some kind of snake with like. There's something like twisting around underneath whatever he's lying.
Yeah,
Interesting.
okay,
Yeah.
very good. So those two figures are probably what?
Deities.
Not exactly.
The two first parents, Adam and Eve.
Yes, they're Adam and Eve.
Huh.
I'm pretty sure, right? Okay, except the snake is on the wrong side, of course.
Oh,
All right.
yeah.
At any rate, all right. Now, let's go from there. We've got Moses at the bottom there, right? And he is. That's a very realistic face, yeah. No, it's not. It's like a Salvatore Dali. Now, what is that thing at the bottom of the page?
The shell.
It looks like the conch shell is spraying something into another shell. That could be a naughty image.
Looks like half an egg almost.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who knows what that means? Maybe it's like the sustaining fluid of life or whatever. I don't know. I think that's bizarre. And it's at the very bottom of the picture. Now, what is at the very top?
sun.
Yeah, it looks like the sun. And actually, that's a pretty authentic depiction of the sun, right?
Yeah.
All that hydrogen, you know, converting to what?
Although the hands kind of.
It's extending its rays.
Yeah, but the hydrogen is like converting to what? Don't you know your
Helium.
nuclear reactions?
Helium?
Yes, helium.
It looks like it's combusting.
How are all the elements created, at least up to iron, I think, right? By what?
Fusion.
Process of nuclear fusion, yes? It takes a huge amount of pressure, energy to create nuclear fusion, right? But however, it looks like that they're rays emanating from the sun. And what are they?
Hands.
Hands.
Hands pointing to what?
Not all of them are
People?
pointing. One of them is like outstretched.
Stop.
Yeah.
Which one?
On the
to the
right
Egyptian head thing.
And on the
in
left,
bronze.
it's a mirror.
Oh yeah.
Oh, one
The
of
dead
them.
guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One on each side.
What did you say?
The hands that are either
Okay.
reaching or stopping instead of pointing.
Yeah, it's totally symmetrical. There's 4 on each side. 3 are pointing and 1's outstretched.
Where's one outstretched?
Second from the top.
You have the skeletons
Yeah.
on both sides.
Oh, I have something in my eyes. So I can't. Oh, yes, I see. All right. Wow. All right. Now, how many? Well, what is the sun? What do you think the sun might represent? The source of creation, yeah?
God.
Perhaps.
But look how the devil is almost grown out of the sun on the right hand side.
Isn't that a common feature in many religions?
Which one's the devil? Oh.
The one that looks like the
Where?
devil.
Oh.
Oh yeah.
The little
I
red
missed that.
It's
devil.
on the right-hand side.
Looking at
Oh
the
yeah,
top.
yeah.
No. By the outstretched hand.
What is going
And
At
the,
least we interpret that
Oh,
as the devil.
I see
There's-
mitosis in the on the.
Yeah.
Oh my
And
gosh.
meiosis.
There's also
yeah.
Although, is that a chicken egg?
That's
Well,
definitely what it
that's
looks
cellular
like.
division and reproduction, right?
Yeah.
In a human
Okay.
egg, it looks like
Wow,
a
this has
cell.
got everything in it. So you can see why it is called the nucleus of creation.
Yeah.
But that refers to, I think, the power of the sun, the
Yeah.
source of creation.
I just noticed this is not related, but there are also 2 hands like behind the skeletons on either side.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Maybe those were actually
I read Adonai.
where?
It's a
Oh.
Hebrew
Oh, is that what the
text
text
on
is?
the right.
By the
upper
Illuminati
quadrant.
Wow.
What's that?
By the Illuminati.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but that's written on a what?
Triangle.
God. Well,
Pyramid.
my lord.
On a pyramid,
Yeah,
yes.
connecting the Egyptians.
And what is the god above that, the Egyptian god?
Oh.
Is
Oh,
Is
the
that
god of.
Set?
I think
No, I
that's
think it's
the blackhead one.
Yeah, the one of the underworld or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't that set?
No.
What?
Horus? No, Horus is
Horus
the falcon
is-
Horus is the falcon god, yeah.
I was pretty sure it was set.
knight. Osiris is the
Was
green
Set?
one.
Isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I might be wrong.
3 of us think so.
I think it's
Okay. Well, now wait a minute.
So
Who's that dude up there in the right-hand corner?
Yeah, Set has the blackhead.
Yes.
Zeus. Lightning
Yeah, when
bolts.
it's lightning. So there's some kind of symmetry. So on the left-hand side in the same quadrant, or is that supposed to be like, I don't know, the ancient Mayans or something?
Oh,
Yeah. It's Mayan. I'm sure that is. Yeah.
See a lot of notable leaders. Is that Martin Luther next to Hitler?
Yes, all right, now we get down here
Bottom of the screen.
to the human beings, right, that are just south of the center of the picture. On the let's look on
Who's that guy?
the left-hand side first. How many of those people can you identify?
On which side?
Marx.
On the left-hand side, the
Uh,
top row.
Is it Genghis Khan or something? Like on the left? I know I've seen that face before.
Yeah, we're on the left.
Karl Marx. The dude with the really bushy beard and
I believe so.
Johannes Brahms.
No.
If only. I wish. Well, definitely Gandhi with the glasses. And then,
Yes, that's Gandhi.
Wait, who's the guy in the red cap?
is that Fidel and Mao?
Like, oh,
No.
Buddha.
Buddha.
Buddha, yes. Who's
I-
the Egyptian woman?
Is that Nefertiti?
Yes, Nefertiti,
Oh.
I believe.
Oh.
What is she doing in here?
Isn't she the goddess of fertility?
She probably could be.
Who's,
She was actual
Egyptian on the other
person.
I'm not sure who that one is.
On the other side, there's another probably
Egyptian?
Egyptian. Yeah.
I'm not sure who that one is.
And who's the wise guy next to him?
The three eyes.
Who is that?
I don't know. The next one's Jesus.
Then there is Jesus, yes,
Hitler.
with the crown. And then who is that? You have any idea who that is?
In the
Next to
flames?
Jesus?
He looks like a Greek statue or something
Maybe.
from
Or
like
Babylonian.
Socrates?
Yeah.
Oh,
The one
Hammurabi?
next to Jesus? I don't think so.
On the right.
Oh,
Who's right underneath Jesus?
Oh, underneath.
Underneath.
Luther.
The guy
Martin
with all the
Luther, yeah. Well, of course. Holy cow. And then, oh my gosh, who's the extreme
Is that
right?
Alexander
Hitler.
the Great?
Yeah.
That has to be Hitler, right?
Mhm. Who's the guy in the middle though? Between the two of them?
Where?
Who, the guy with the turban?
No, the guy with the kind of baby face between.
Lofty hair.
Yeah, yeah. between Hitler
I
and.
didn't recognize that face.
It's Napoleon.
Oh,
yeah.
No.
Let's see.
Nice.
Is this like the political compass?
Is it Alexander the Great on the left?
I thought it was
Was that
Caesar.
Wait, it totally
Oh.
is.
Actually, probably the one on the far left is Alexander, and then Caesar after him, just to the right.
Maybe. And who's the like Babylonian looking dude with the sculpted beard on the far right in the top row?
I have no idea.
With the three eyes.
I don't know who all these
No.
people are.
This guy.
But you recognize these people, yeah? Okay. Now,
Was it Nazis?
here is the story behind this particular painting, and you won't believe this.
Dr. Lawler, do you need that glass of water for your eye or something?
What?
Do you need that glass of water for your eye or something?
I'll just let it go on. I'll sit in the
Oh
door.
yeah, not that. Yeah, sorry for that. See there.
But it's really, I think I got a piece of chalk dust in it. But anyway,
Gosh,
okay. Well, this painting is from, I believe it's from the 40s. And one of Kala's close friends gave her this book by Freud. And the book is Moses
And monotheism.
and Monotheism. Now, I think that book was written in 1939, and Kahlo read it, and this painting is a result of that. And Freud one of the things that he tried to do was to interpret history from a psychoanalytic point of view. And now you're going to have to fasten your seatbelts on this. And you know, Freud was also Jewish, and he was always wondering about what was the origin of the Jewish people. And everyone knows from the Pentateuch, right, or the Genesis and the Exodus story, that the Hebrews were enslaved in Egypt, right? And then there's the great liberation, Moses leading the Hebrews out of Egypt to freedom, whatever. They wandered around for a while. Well, he takes a different story. He says that Moses was actually an Egyptian, and he was born into a royal family in Egypt, and that he became increasingly displeased with the Egyptians. And he stumbled upon the fact that there was one and only one true God. And he tried to convince other people that the polytheism of the Egyptians was wrong. and that there was only one God, Aten. And pretty soon the Greeks were, the leaders for this group of people who believed in Aten were persecuted, and they left, tried to leave Egypt, and in doing so, they wandered around in the desert. Well, eventually, they killed Moses, and the people that were left wandering around in the desert ran into another nomadic tribe. Well, this nomadic tribe worshipped a volcano god. And what was the volcano god's name? We're not supposed to say it, but we'll say it anyway. Begins with a J. Yahweh. Yahweh was a volcano god. Okay, at any rate, so these people that had worshipped Aten joined together with the people that were monotheistic and worshipped the volcano god Yahweh. And the people who had killed Moses became totally guilt-ridden that they'd done something really bad. Right?
Did he get this story from like sources,
Or did he
or
just
was he
make
just
this?
He made this up. It's an explanation for the biblical exodus from Egypt and
Okay.
why the Hebrews were in Egypt in the first place.
Okay.
So
How is that any preferable to the story that's actually written down in the account?
because it accounts for the notion of guilt and shame and the assuagement of guilt through, perpetuation or
Isn't that already accounted for?
what?
Isn't that already accounted for in the biblical account? Like,
I
why do you
don't-
need to
well,
make
I
up
don't
a
think
new
so.
story
I don't
when
know,
there
but
was
he's
one that was
trying to-
already written?
He's trying to frame it in terms of a psychoanalytic frame. It's just it's another myth, isn't it? I mean, it's just another way of symbolically representing things. But at any rate, she reads this book and paints this painting. Now, there are 3 essays in that book, and I will have to say that I have not read all 3 of the essays. I've read the first one, which is the fantastic story of Moses as an Egyptian. But Moses actually was apparently raised as an Egyptian, right? Okay. All right. Well, she finally admitted that after looking back at the book and reading it again, and considering the painting, that she actually misinterpreted it. But why do you think all these figures are in here? Who are all of these people?
Very few of them represent monotheistic religions.
But they represent what? Most of these people in here, even if you don't know them.
Became
They are a
Leaders.
kind of
Leaders.
messenger among the rulers and among the gods.
What's that?
I'm reading what she wrote about the painting.
Yeah, there's a short thing that she wrote.
A huge
preserved.
number of high and mighty people to transform religions in human society.
Right.
Yeah,
So
or-
all of these are philosophers,
yeah, some sort of like
religious figures, and apparently they all emanate or connect to the source of creation. Now, what does this have to do with Akhenaten? Well, Akhenaten was actually Amenhotep the Fourth.
Yeah, he was a real pharaoh.
Yes, he was a real pharaoh. And he is the one that tried to get rid of polytheism in Egypt. And he reigned for about 15 years and did a lot of, well, I don't know, he did a lot of things. And he had many children. You wouldn't know this, but you might know it. He had 2 wives, apparently. One of his wives was Nefertiti. Queen Nefertiti. And one of his sons was Tutankhamun, right? So he's not an insignificant pharaoh. He decided that there was only, one god, the sun god, right? And that was Aten. And so the sun depicts Aten as the source of all creation. And we still haven't decided what the hands represent. She says what they represent, I think. They're the all-encompassing hands of mortality, right? The source of creation gives life and it takes it away. So the hands extending out are the touch of death or the touch of mortality, right? Well, at any rate, I think that's an interesting painting, and it's very colorful, and it's highly symbolic, and it tells that story. But it's not really the story that Freud is telling, because it's a much more universal story. Okay. All right, so let's put that away, and now let's go to air guitar. How many of you have read A Simple Heart? Did you read A Simple Heart? Okay, well that's fantastic. Like 2 people, right? All right, that's very good. All right. What'd you get out of that story?
Heartbreak.
Well, the first essay is Unbreak My Heart, and this is A Simple Heart. What is this story
And in
about?
between was a home in the neon.
What?
Felicity.
In between was the home in the neon.
I didn't get that.
The essay in between.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Anybody want to talk about this? Simple Heart?
I found
We're
even the
headed for a
synopsis.
train wreck.
I
What?
found even the synopsis to be really depressing.
The synopsis of the book?
Yeah.
Of the story?
As he
The
talked through
Simple
the
Heart?
story, it just made me sad.
Yeah, well, what is he trying to say in this? On page, see, I can't really discuss this unless you have read it. Well, let's look at the bottom of page 26. The tacit parallel between Flaubert's endeavors and those of his character, Félicité, I think may be inferred from the peculiarities of tense and tone that complicate The Simple Heart. More certainly, since given Flaubert's method, we may presume that these peculiarities are far from inadvertent. In 2 passages describing the local landscape, for instance, Flaubert slips abruptly into the present tense. This is a jolting effect in French, but it has the effect of collapsing the distance between the author and his narrative by substituting the voice of Gustave, a local citizen, for that of Flaubert, the all-seeing author. A similar collapse of authorial distance occurs in those moments when Flaubert's cool narration of Félicité's existence suddenly glitters with sophisticated contempt. Now, this essay, if you come upon it and you haven't read every piece of literature known to man, would this make any sense to you?
No, because you have to know what happens in the books. By
Yes, but doesn't he tell you what happens? He gives you enough to tell you what happens and why he thinks this is so important, and why sitting on the swing, the porch swing in his home in Dallas, outside of Dallas, Texas, right? He just suddenly flew into fits of ecstasy and called all of his friends and say, wow, have you read this story? It's really amazing. What's amazing about it? He tells you what he thinks is amazing about it. On the next page, it says, considering Félicité as a character in the story, then, it helps to think of her as Flaubert's Job. That's not Job, it's Job. A character equally afflicted, yet bereft of Job's anger at the injustices of his afflictions. Now look, and constantly in literature, and this is one of what is it? What is his name? Is it Yale? Famous critic, Harold Bloom's. One of his famous ideas is that themes in literature keep repeating themselves over and over again, and that it's important to understand culture and historical context, because these images, which carry philosophical and mythological import, keep repeating themselves over and over again in each new generation with a contemporary relevance. And if you don't understand the historical context or the meaning that they have originally, then you don't know what's being commuted in literature. Well, this is an example, and Mr. Hickey is, amazingly literate man, an incredible writer. And here it is, a reference to Job. What is Job?
He's
It's a book in the Bible, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, and what happens to Job?
He's tortured by God.
Stuff.
What?
A lot of bad stuff.
Yeah, a lot of really bad things happen to him.
And like, there's no reason why. It's kind of
He
arbitrary.
keeps asking God,
Yeah.
why? Why? Yes?
Yeah.
And what's the answer?
Testing. See if he's.
Is there an answer?
No.
No.
What does Job come
That's
up
nothing
with?
he did.
What?
There. Yes and no. It's not.
He doesn't like.
It's
deserve
not like he's being punished for something.
It doesn't make sense by like our standards of like,
Yes.
you do something bad.
But the
you do
explanation
something
is
bad.
that that God and the devil are kind of placing bets on if Job will curse God. So it's a testing. That's the reason if you want one.
Does he ever does he ever curse God?
I don't think so. No.
But he is subjected to, incredible pain and anguish and misfortune, right? Well, Flaubert says, Job's character equally afflicted, yet bereft of Job's anger. He is angry at his afflictions, right? But Félicité never recoils from the injustices in her life.
Well, it
And
seems like she's not like. It seems like she's not like reacting that way because she's like kind or patient or whatever, or more so than Job, but more that she just doesn't really understand what's happening to her.
She's simple.
Yeah.
Simple heart.
well, it says a simple heart. And she actually has a sense of innocence in that respect.
Or naivete.
Right, naivete is that. Okay. The years pass quite well. There are two other characters. There is her, the woman who hires her as, a housekeeper, and then the woman's daughter who dies of tuberculosis or something in school, and then a Victor who is her nephew, and that she loves dearly, that comes to visit her, really under the guise of getting things from her, and eventually goes off to an adventure in America and dies of malaria or whatever. And so the two things that Félicité really loves or has some affection for are taken away from her. And neither one really is directly related to her, well, except for her nephew. And Virginie is Madame Aubyn's daughter. So at any rate, it says, the years pass quietly until one summer afternoon, the two of them visit Virginie's room, which has been left intact. They clean the shelves, reorder the toys, and refold the dead girl's clothing. And this is Flaubert's description. The sun shone brightly on these shabby things, showing up the stains and creases caused by the movement of her body. The sun was warm, the sky blue, a blackbird trilled. Every living thing seemed to be full of sweetness and light. They found a little hat made of furry brown plush, but it was all moth-eaten. Félicité asked if she might have it. Their eyes met, filled with tears. Finally, the mistress opened her arms. The servant fell into them, and they embraced. appeasing their grief in a kiss which made them equal. It was the first time in their lives for Madame Aubain was not naturally forthcoming. Félicité was as grateful to her as if she had received a gift, and from then on loved her with dog-like devotion and religious adoration. What on earth does that mean?
She became hopelessly attached to her.
Why?
I guess she was actually nice to her.
Why?
She had
What
no other figure in her life to whom to look up to. She,
Yes, but it was the act of the embrace, was it not? The two of them were joined together in some kind of moment of grief or emotion, yes? And they embrace each other. And Flaubert says Félicité fell into her arms. Like, just didn't embrace her, but fell into her arms. And then he says, appeasing their grief in a kiss which made them equal.
Is this a literal kiss or a figurative kiss?
No, I think it's literal.
these are French people, remember?
Indeed.
It's not like a.
Well, I mean, you know, it's not a.
It's
Okay, well. But what is this? What is that an act of? You know, so this is one of my primal themes. I think, you know, Hickey gives enough information about the mistress or the head of the household and her, like, dour existence and the fact that her only daughter or her daughter has died, and she's there in that lonely house with Félicité, who tries to keep it up, and she's Aubain is very stingy, and you know, you don't get the impression that it's like some opulent, rich house and that. So the two of them are grief-stricken in this dusty old room that they're trying to clean up, and suddenly they are hit by the love that they had for Virginie. And so they embrace. And so what happens?
So it's like a moment of understanding between them?
Yes. But it's actually coming from whom? Not Félicité. It's coming from Madame Aubain, right? And because she's essentially unapproachable, or has not really treated her with any kind of respect, although Félicité doesn't say anything about that. But she does respond to this. And how does she respond?
By becoming like the most generous person she can be.
Yes. Right. And so what does that imply? Did Madame Aubain have to do that?
No.
No. She wasn't thinking about it. They were lost in something else. A common emotion. Yes? Grief over loss. But Félicité interprets that as some gesture of kindness from the madam.
Like,
right?
she's hardly ever received anything like that, so just like that one action is like
Yes.
completely blown out of proportion.
Yes, and if
compared
you,
to what it would be for most people.
well, yes, we're getting closer. But I don't think Madame Aubain, if you read the story, which we did in the seminar a couple of years ago, at least a couple of people read it, but she is, Aubain is not exactly a woman that's filled with compassion and emotion. But here, the veil of protection or whatever has been lifted, and suddenly they embrace in this moment of of shared emotion or grief. But I don't think that Aubain did that on purpose. It was just something that was appropriate to the moment. Yet that was not Félicité's interpretation of it. And so, what is this an action of? And it's the only sense in which altruistic behavior makes any sense. I'm not too. I think that word has bad connotations, but this is the only sense in which that word makes sense.
Vulnerability?
What?
Vulnerability?
Well, the action here was precipitated by a kind of vulnerability.
Connect.
Yeah, but they connect in that sense, yes. But I'm trying to get you to focus on the dynamic between Felicité's interpretation and, the kind of non-interpretation that Eben Alban has.
Well,
She's doing it not as with a purpose, right? Do you see what I'm trying to say? I might not be saying it correctly. That Félicité considers it an action of intense compassion, right? As a gift, it considers it as a gift, right?
it doesn't match up with like
Yes,
what Madame Aubert
yes,
had in mind. When
yes. If she
came
had
forward.
anything in mind, except for her
Which is-
own personal expression of grief or matching of grief.
Yeah.
And perhaps she gets something from Félicité that's exactly the same. Come on.
So like there wasn't actually as much understanding between the two of us.
Well, there could be, but it led to some kind of total understanding. It made them equal. Two very unequal
Did it
people.
truly make them equal, or did it make Félicité feel that she was equal?
It made them equal in that moment.
Oh,
And
Ben
that-
think so?
I think so.
Flaubert thought so.
I'm not sure.
I think so.
Well,
But what I'm trying to say is that I don't think Madame Aubin was aware of what she was doing.
Maybe
I
don't
think she
know
got
her
caught in the moment of grief or expression of grief. But Félicité interprets that as something much more.
maybe they were equal in that moment, but does that continue?
No,
No.
of course not. However, it does something to Félicité. It changes her life. So how does she interpret that action of Aubin? Was she expecting it?
No.
No. But she said that she received it as a gift, right? Right. What is an unexpected or unpremeditated gift?
The trap.
No, that's right. That suddenly changes your life. Oh, I talk about this all the time.
Admission to the Curtis Institute of Music.
Yes, right.
There's a word for it.
Begins with a G.
Grace.
Yes.
Oh.
Grace is an unmerited favor, right? And so Flaubert is expressing here the concept of grace. The person who gives the gift is unaware. And Aubin was unaware that Félicité was going to interpret it this way. Yes, she did, and it changed her life. So the person who gives the gift cannot be aware of it, is not aware of it. That is the true definition, I think, if you're going to use that word, of altruistic behavior. You following?
I thought that altruistic behavior was the opposite. Like the person does whatever
No.
good-hearted thing they're doing because they
That's what I'm
expect
saying.
to be like recognized.
That's
and
what I
appreciated.
just said.
Well,
I
that's
said I
associated with
disagree
the
with
word,
that.
but that's not part of what the word is.
Yeah.
It's only, that's something that we've tied onto it.
Right.
So it's, what you're saying is like, what the Bible says, like your right hand should not know what your left hand is doing. Like you don't even know that you're
Well,
giving it out.
that
Yeah.
coincides with that. But I think that that is a motivation for genuine morality. I think if it's not based on that concept, well, then there is some kind of purpose behind it. There cannot be a purpose in goodness.
There shouldn't be any like
Agenda.
Agenda or ulterior motive, right? And in this case, there was no motive. But Félicité, as she said, I'll say it over and over again, considered it a gift. Okay. And then at the end, Félicité gets this parrot. And it's an unruly bird. You know anything about parrots? Parrots, not parents. Parrots. I think they're absolutely beautiful, but they're cantankerous,
Yeah.
right? And they're interesting things, but she worshipped that parrot, right? And she transferred all of her her love and her gift that she was opened up to that parent. And it was, the parent wasn't reciprocating, was it? Apparently not. And then one day she found it dead on the hearth, right? And you have to know the story, the things that she went through to get that parrot stuffed, right? It was just unbelievable. She endured so much hardship. And I don't know. But at the very end, these are basically the closing words of A Simple Heart. We're at the bottom of page 28. Read with me. Félicité, of course, is delighted with the parrot. She feeds it, pampers it, and teaches it to say, Hail Mary. We're talking about the Catholics here, okay? The parrot rebels, complains, tries to escape, and ultimately dies on the hearth. But this time, Félicité has a response. She has the parrot stuffed, installs it in her room, and proceeds to worship it, to reconstruct it mentally as an embodiment of her loss and desire. At this point, the entire artifice of the narrative snaps into focus. It becomes clear, explicating those attributes and significations that Félicité will ultimately invest in the parrot. The parrot's gaudy wings are those of the Holy Spirit in stained glass. Its truculent masculinity, an attribute of her lost lover, the loveliness of that of the daughter, and its American homeland, an homage to young Victor, who died there. The parrot embodies all of these attributes for Félicité, and thus, in the final scene of the story, she is reunited with all that she had lost, or never had, all those things she never knew she might deserve. A cloud of blue incense smoke rose up to Félicité's room. Well, you have to know what's actually going on outside. There's a celebration. I don't think it's Corpus Christi, but some religious procession. She opened wide her nostrils as she breathed in deeply, in an act at once sensual and mystical. She closed her eyes, her lips smiled. Her heartbeat grew steadily slower, fainter every time, softer like a fountain running dry, like an echo fading as she breathed her last. She thought she saw, as the heavens opened, a gigantic parrot hovering over her head. All right. And so now we come to the point of all of this writing. I just think this is absolutely fantastic. Let's look on page 30. The language that we share before the emblem of what we lack, however as fractious and inconsequent as it often seems, creates a new society. It is nothing more or less than the kiss that makes us equal. You know who George Sand is, right? She actually asked him to write this story. Had George Sand lived to read the story her friend wrote for her, I think she would have understood this. Or more precisely, she would have felt the thorn in the rose her friend offered up to her and recognized in the very title of the story, A Simple Heart, a repudiation of the sensible heart, or the feeling heart, that stood as an emblem for the cult of sensibile, or sensibility, which Sand was the natural inheritor. As you will remember, this cult of the sensible defined, my eyes are going bad, defined virtue in terms of one's superior ability to empathize with those less fortunate than oneself. I call that limousine liberalism. It's one aspect of that, right? Less fortunate might themselves have been feeling was, as W.H. Auden shrewdly pointed out, simply beside the point. Because then as now, the cult of sensible feeling defined itself as an aristocracy of feeling. wholly dedicated to the connoisseurship of its own virtuous empathy. Now that is one of the points. And so he finally says at the end, Flaubert is dead, and the disciplines of desire have lost their urgency in the grand salons of comfort and the privilege we have created for the arts. The self-congratulatory rhetoric of sensibility or feeling continues to perpetuate itself, and in place of the gorgeous parrots, we now content ourselves with the ghostly successors of Marie Antoinette's peasant village, tastefully installed within the walls of Versailles. Well, so what is this saying?
Sorry, I must go. Sorry.
What is this saying?
Here's the punchline.
It's actually saying that it's better to be simple. Or is he not?
What is sensibility? He says that you can't manufacture feeling, right? And that feeling is not institutional. And that art, when it becomes institutional as a means of communicating what it means to be, feeling or compassionate, you remove yourself from the simple experience, that genuine feeling and compassion. And that Félicité's stuffed parrot, as an image, which is a work of art, embodies those genuine things. And that when she looked at that, she was reminded of those feelings which she did not have on her own. Thank you.